Long before the pigeon and the magpie made Mr. Heathpants a household name, there was this, the MHP Mark II, a fully automatic flywheel blaster that gives off some serious MP7 vibes and is one of the blasters people ask me about the most. And despite essentially being a Strifeoid platform, it has some really cool things going for it. So today I'm going to break down the 7 things that I think you should know about it. My name is Brandon, and the MHP-15 Mark II was actually my first half-dart blaster, and I built it expressly with that purpose. It's also one of my personal favorites, despite having spent more time on that bench than all of my other blasters combined. When I was originally building this blaster, my left half had warped, and I didn't notice until I was going to assemble it, and nothing fit. And after I reprinted my left half and went to reassemble everything, I dropped the right half on the ground on concrete, and it shattered into multiple pieces, and I had to glue it together, which means I had to completely sand and repaint it. Then my motor cover tabs snapped off, and they had to be glued back on, and they had to be repainted. Then my flywheel cage didn't quite fit inside. I kept trying to close the blaster, and something would hit something else, and to keep taking it apart and dremeling it and putting it back together and taking it apart and dremeling it for a very long time. But once I got it working, tested, and chronoed, I took it to a game for the first time, and after putting 3 rounds down it, the motor in the pusher gave out, because it actually stripped all the teeth off of the pinion gear. So I replaced the pinion gear, and still no dice. And it turns out that the teeth inside the TT motor had also been stripped. So I replaced them with metal gears. And then the metal gears eventually started to slip and fuse together because they were made of extremely cheap metal that I'm not even 100% sure is metal. And ultimately, I had to replace it with a 3rd gearbox. And now it works. I forgot where I was going with this. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a Strifeoid platform, which means that its internals basically mirror that of a Strife. In today's ecosystem, where 3D printed blasters are getting more complex and creative in their engineering, they often have proprietary cages now, and that means that you can't really reuse any parts between your blasters, or if you have older hardware that you want to repurpose, you can't really use it. But you should be able to use pretty much any Strife cage in this, including all of the open flywheel project stuff, as long as the crush is at least maybe 42.5 millimeters, because anything further apart than that is going to risk getting too close to the tops and the bottoms of the shell, and you have to Dremel away part of the rail and part of the trigger area, which you can do, but just go with a higher crush. I also want to point out that the Morpheus guide will not fit in this. It's too close to where the pusher sits, and it kind of runs into everything, and you can't actually fire it. So, no Morpheus cage. Sorry. Even the auto pusher uses this same little yellow TT gearbox that comes in most of the Strife auto Strife kits. So if you have one of those, you can repurpose the gearbox from your auto Strife kit and make an MHP-15 that's fully automatic instead. And speaking of the auto pusher, it's actually an optional drop-in module. If you don't use the auto pusher, there's space for a solenoid, which is basically an electromagnet that uses power to propel a little pusher arm mechanism thing that pushes the dart into the flywheels, which would make it semi-automatic by default. However, Heath did include a firing circuit diagram created by Adrian Ward that allows you to create a select fire circuit so that you can do single or fully automatic fire. But be aware that that is pretty complex and will require a lot more material, and you're gonna have to find space for all the wires in the shell, which does not sound fun to me. But I will link to Heath's overview of the MHP-15 Mark II, which actually shows his select fire wiring, and you can kind of look at it and maybe reverse engineer it along with the schematic if you really want to. I also want to point out that this auto pusher does not have an inherent place for you to put an extra switch in order to make sure that your firing control finishes its cycle. What that means is when you are pulling the trigger and the auto pusher is running, when you let go of the trigger, the pusher is just going to stop wherever it's at the moment that you release the trigger. There's nothing to make sure that it comes all the way back once the trigger is released and the circuit is cut. On blasters like a Rapid Strike, they actually have an extra switch that is depressed by the pusher and basically acts as an extra trigger so that once you take your finger off, that switch is still depressed, and that way the pusher still continues its motion, and when it comes back, it lets up on that switch, which then deactivates the circuit, and it always just stops where it's supposed to be. which isn't that big of a deal. It's more of a usability and feel kind of thing. Because when you use a blaster long enough, especially a fully automatic blaster, you get a feel for, if I hold the trigger down for this many fractions of a second, I'm going to fire 1 dart, or 2 darts, or 3 darts, etc., etc. And if you don't know if the pusher is forward or backward, you don't know if you thread that trigger where it's starting from, so you don't know how long it's going to take to actually get a dart to fire. Because at worst case, the pusher is fully extended and stopping a dart from coming up, and once you pull the trigger, it has to pull all the way back, let that dart up, and then go forward again to fire. Granted, there is still quite a bit of space in the back, even with the auto pusher, so you can definitely wire up something yourself with some experimentation and timing, but naturally there's no spot to just kind of like screw a switch in. The next thing I think is worth mentioning is that it has a really cool trigger. Most triggers slide on the x-axis to operate whatever it is they're operating, but this trigger actually rotates on a pivot. When the trigger is going down, it actually spins up the flywheels, and when the trigger is pulling back and kind of completes its arc, then it starts to fire. It's also worth mentioning that there are actually 2 trigger designs in the file set. There's the 2-stage trigger, which I am describing, where partially pulling the trigger revs the flywheels and fully depressing the trigger starts to fire. And there's a single stage trigger that requires much less pressure to actually fire. And basically once you pull it, it starts spinning the flywheels and operating the pusher at the same time. So you really only want to do that if you have very fast motors that can get up to speed before that dart collides with them. Otherwise you're going to burn out your motors. Also, to get it out of the way, it takes katanas and talons. However, you have to print different grips depending on which version you want to support. I know that sounds normal now, but back when this blaster came out, quite a few 3D printed blasters were either only katanas or only talons. And this was no exception. When Heath first released it, it only supported katanas, like most of his other blasters. And he added talon support later in an untested format, and depending on which files you got, there were some problems. In fact, my version has a lot of trouble fitting a regular Talon magazine. It's just like a little bit too thick. No matter how much I sand this down, it just doesn't fit smoothly. However, these 3D printed hybrid mags, which is most of the 3D printed magazines nowadays, fits in there perfectly because they always tend to be a little bit smaller in order to fit in a katana mag well, so it works fine. The other notable difference between the two is the mag release. On the Talon version, there is no mag release. It's just friction. You pull it, you push it in, there's a little detent on a spring that locks it in place. On the katana version, this part right here in the bottom of the grip is actually a switch, and depressing down with your index finger will drop the magazine. I have no idea how well that version works because I've never made one, so Bah. Functionality aside, the next thing I think you should know about this blaster is just that it feels good. It has great ergonomics. The blaster's size is somewhere between a primary and a sidearm. It's not too heavy, it's not too light. The grip has great curves for your thumb so it doesn't cut into your hand. There's a nice finger rest right here. The grip is comfy, the stock extends, the weight is just very perfectly balanced in the middle, so when you're holding it with one hand, it's not like leaning to one side or the other, so you can use it with one hand very easily. I've run with this, it's just really great to use. Also, there's this cool little like door thing, so you can look inside and check if you have a round and look into your flywheels, get a jam out of there. It's really satisfying to use. It's one of those things that you don't notice unless there's something wrong with a blaster when you use it for a while and it just starts to annoy you by holding it. This blaster never irritates me. It always is just fantastic. There are also designs for a folding grip that locks at the 90 and 45 degree angle marks. However, I found it a little bit too stubby and uncomfortable for my hands, so I printed this one instead. Also, because it does contribute to the weight, the battery chamber is this entire lower section down here, basically under the barrel all the way back to about this point, which is very spacious. I have a pretty large battery in there and it fits just fine, which is important because this is a 3S build with an auto pusher and requires a significant amount of power to power all of that comfortably. And the sixth thing, and thing that everybody will ask, where can you get one? And the answer is, your guess is as good as mine. As far as I know, there are currently no shops that sell this blaster or kits for this blaster. Frontline Foam has historically been licensed to sell MHP blasters, and I believe that they actually sold the parts for this for a short period of time. However, all of those listings have since been removed. And the design is released under a non-commercial license, and I did not see any sort of exception for commissions. So your best bet is to either print and build it yourself, or have a friend print it at cost. That said, these shell components are about 320 millimeters wide, and will not fit on most print beds. However, Heath has kindly included a version of the shell that is split in half, so you can just print all 4 components on like a 200 millimeter bed, and then either screw or glue them together. None of the prints are exceptionally difficult or troublesome, however they require a significant amount of supports, so you will burn through quite a bit of material printing this thing. And if you don't have the means to print one yourself, I think it's absolutely worth reaching out to Heath to see if he's building them on commission, if Frontline Foam is still technically licensed to sell you a copy, or if he's willing to give permission for you to have one printed. You never know. Doesn't hurt to ask. Despite the fact that this blaster is from 2018 and still quite a few people don't even know it exists, Heath is actually working on a new version of this blaster as we speak. Probably. About a year ago, Heath had posted pictures and videos of the Mark III prototype he was working on that I believe fit a hurricane cage, with an option for a flywheel, the world cage, I think. However, recently Heath showed pictures of a Mark IV and basically made it sound like the Mark III is dead. But since those images came out recently, assuming nothing happens to that project, there might be a Mark IV sometime in 2021. Who knows? Even if the Mark IV drops tomorrow, it won't look and feel like this. So if this is what you want, you should still print it, even though a new version is on the way. Especially because if you're interested in this blaster over other flywheel platforms, it is probably for its aesthetics, design, and ergonomics. So no other blaster looks like this one. Even if there is a new one, if you want it to look like this one, print this one. And although many community design blasters tend to fall by the wayside as newer and newer, cooler blasters come out, I still think this has a place in the hobby. It's fully automatic, which is not very common among 3D printed blasters or even the commercial foam blasters, with the exception of Rival. And as I said before, the ergonomics of this are great, and if you're going to be running around on a field for a few hours, it's nice to have something that fits comfortably in your hands. Especially at longer HVZ events, where you're there for hours and hours and sometimes days, having something that is comfortable in this form factor is worth a lot, no matter how old the blaster is and whether there are newer alternatives. Plus, the weight distribution, as I mentioned before, makes it very easy to run with one-handed or close to the chest, so if you have to grab objectives or MacGuffins or otherwise interact with your hands, this is perfect. Plus, it fits that large battery, and more blasters these days are getting smaller and smaller, and it's harder to keep using a large battery because everything needs to fit in the palm of your hand now, and there's just no space for them. And because it's compatible with Strife cages, you can keep using all of the motors and wheels and cages that are still being sold in this hobby and are easy to obtain. You can basically take anything that you own right now and throw it into this blaster, rather than having to design your internals around the blaster, if that makes sense. But to circle all the way back around, I get a lot of questions about this blaster, and I really like this blaster. So if you have any questions about it, drop them in the comments down below, and I will get back to you. And as always, thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like. Feel free to subscribe for more content like this in the future, and I'll see you next time.